Republican candidate in the race. We have to see if this becomes a giant deal and if he's taken seriously and if he winds up having a chance to win at least one state, let alone some states. But apparently he's backed by some significant money. His name is Evan McMullin, and he is now the anti-Trump Republican candidate in the race. Now, you must be wondering the same thing everybody else in the world is wondering. Who the hell is Evan McMullin? Well, he's the anti-Trump also in that he had, at the time of the announcement, 135 followers on Twitter. Not 135,000, just 135, okay? His friends barely know who he is. So let me tell you who he is and why, more importantly, he's in the race and who's backing him, because that will determine everything. So he's a graduate of BYU. Now that's very relevant, but I'll get back to it at the end and I'll tell you why that's relevant. He's also a graduate of the Wharton School of Business, MBA. So is Trump. Apparently that's a prerequisite to run as a Republican. They reached out to me, but I turned them down. Anyway, CIA veteran, and that's the majority of his work career has been in the CIA. He has also been recently the House Republicans' chief policy director, so worked on policy, but also very tight with the very conservative House Republicans. He worked with the United Nations, but don't get the wrong idea in figuring out how to, it's not fair to say block refugees, but on whether to admit refugees into different countries. And then finally, the most important part, former Goldman Sachs employee. And as you look at that track record, I mean, it is a perfect sausage, or if you will, donor kebab, that you would put together if you were Republican donors. You're like, let's sprinkle a little military-industrial complex in there, a little bit of the intelligence agencies, secret connections. We'll put something globalist in there. And then finally, of course, a healthy smattering of banker. So, and it's almost like they made him up out of whole cloth. Here's a guy who did not exist in the public eye at all, never run for public office, hasn't been on TV as an expert or anything, very young, unmarried, is followed by no one at all. They're like, how do we get a guy who will serve all of our interests? You almost have to look through almost the entire 330 million people in America to find one. But that's what I always tell you guys. The donors can always find somebody that they're going to back. And so Trump didn't work out, so now they've got a new guy that they're going to throw in there. Now, let me tell you what McMullin says he's running it for, and then I'll tell you what he's actually running for. He says on his new website, evanmcmullin.com, that started literally today, millions of Americans, he says, are not being represented by either of these candidates. Those of us who care about the strength of the military and intelligence services find little to embrace in either Trump or Clinton. Now, that's theoretically why he cares to run, they claim. Now, in reality, you can argue with that. Hillary Clinton is, if anything, too hawkish. And there's a lot of people in the military and intelligence agencies that like Hillary Clinton a lot. Some defense contractors would like even more money directed their way. So maybe they have a slight issue with Hillary Clinton. They all have issues with Donald Trump because they don't know which direction he's going. And he says finally, just as the American Revolution required men and women devoted to liberty and freedom to stand up and be counted, this moment calls a new generation to the same sacred task. With that in mind, I have decided to pursue the cause of American renewal and the presidency of the United States of America. Now, why is this getting any attention? You have to understand, every race, there's actually hundreds of people who run for president. But nobody ever knows about them because they're like random-ass Evan McMullin, and they're like, oh yeah, me too, I'm running for president. But they can't get on all the ballots, and they never get any attention. So why is this guy getting attention? Because it isn't about Evan McMullin. It's about the guys behind Evan McMullin. So to that point, Joe Scarborough basically teased this news in the morning before it broke completely. He said, I could be wrong, but several good sources told me that people, Republicans from, let's just say, never Trump land, found somebody and they were going to put good money behind him. Because if Evan McMullin ran with the $13 he has in his pocket, you would have never heard about him. But instead, people with a lot of money are saying, go get him, Evan boy, go get him. We found you. Go, put you out there. So more from BuzzFeed. So BuzzFeed breaks the story later in the day. They say, people close to the effort suggested McMullin would have the backing of serious Republican donors and fundraisers. So here we are. Now we're getting to it. So these are all the donors who don't like the talk of Donald Trump when he says things like, maybe we'll default on our loan, which would be disastrous for the U.S. economy, for interest rates, for the U.S. banks, for a lot of people doing business. It would create instability. They also can't control him, so the donors don't like renegades. They don't like mavericks. That's the reason why in 2000, even though John McCain appeared to be the much better candidate, almost all the donors backed George W. Bush instead, because George Bush said, yes, sir. What do you need, sir? McCain said, I'm a maverick. Give it to me instead. Now, he wound up getting in 2008, but even then they were a little reluctant because they don't like mavericks. And by that time, if you followed closely, John McCain was no longer a maverick. He understood how the game was played. You go do exactly what the donors tell you to do. Now, Trump beat all that by playing a really interesting populist game in the primaries. And this is the revenge of the donors. They're back. The empire strikes back. Now, Donald Trump's a horrible guy and would be a terrible president. So they put us in this weird predicament. I'm certainly not rooting for either side. What I'm telling you is the reality behind the political games that are being played. In BuzzFeed, they mentioned that veteran Republican strategist Rick Wilson was one of the guys backing him. He's a very strident, never Trump guy. And his group is called Better for America. Now, I guarantee you, you follow the money, you follow Better for America, and you'll have your answer as to who's involved in this basically belated coup within the Republican Party. They should have done this a long time ago if they wanted it to be more effective. So then you think, do they really think this guy, who no one knows, can actually become president? No, they don't. So what they have decided is, we're going to run this guy and hope that he wins one, maybe a couple of states, so that we make sure that under all circumstances, Donald Trump does not win. In fact, that's not I'm not the only person with that theory. Let me give you another quote from BuzzFeed. They also pointed to his ties to Utah, a state where polls show Trump badly underperforming with the Mormon-heavy electorate. McMullin, an alum of Brigham Young University, plans to aggressively contest the state. Aha! There we go. Now we're getting closer to the truth. So they're thinking, even if we just knock Utah off the board for Trump, it still makes it much, much harder for Trump to win. In other words, these huge donors are saying, look, we can't in good conscience give to Hillary Clinton, and they've got their issues with her. But in reality, she would be so much better for the rich, for the powerful, for corporations than Donald Trump would. Not because Donald Trump wouldn't cut their taxes more. He would. But he's so unstable that there is a faction of that donor base who goes, never Trump. I'll take my chances with Hillary. And in fact, I'll sabotage Trump's campaign by running this guy just to make sure that Trump doesn't win. Go back to Scarborough for one more minute. He also said, you can get on the ballots for up to 300 electoral votes. You can bring lawsuits in other places. I think at this point, the people that are talking about funding this are more interested in Trump losing than electing their candidate. Definitely. There's no one silly enough to think that Evan McMullin is going to be the next president of the United States. So even those giant donors, they're not spending all that money so that this kid, honestly, could become president. They're doing it so that Trump doesn't become president. Now, an inkling as to who it might be, by the way, is given to you on this same day, probably not coincidentally, by a great number of Republican heavyweights that came out with a letter against Trump. In that letter, these are all Republicans. They say, we are convinced that Trump would be a dangerous president and would put at risk our country's national security and well-being. They said, most fundamentally, Mr. Trump lacks the character, values, and experience to be president. So who are these Republicans? I'll get to that in 1 second. One more quote from those guys. They say he weakens U.S. moral authority as the leader of the free world. He appears to lack basic knowledge about and belief in the U.S. Constitution, U.S. laws, and U.S. institutions, including religious tolerance, freedom of the press, and an independent judiciary. Now, this is not a group that has in the past cared that much about independent judiciaries and freedom of the press. My guess is that they have other financial interests at stake here. Let me read you the list. Michael Hayden, a guy that I've told you about that participated in wiretapping all Americans. Michael Chertoff, another huge Bush heavyweight. Tom Ridge, both former heads of Department of Homeland Security. Dobbs Zakheim, John Negroponte, Eric Edelman, Dick Cheney, Robert Zoellick. These are neocons. And Dick Cheney is a big name on that list. You might be thinking, well, Trump's going to bring torture back. Cheney should be happy about that. But Trump also said what a stupid idea the Iraq War was. And you know whose idea that was? Dick Cheney's idea. So Cheney didn't like that kind of talk. So the guys who like more wars are also a little concerned that Donald Trump won't start enough of them because he's more of an isolationist. That's interesting. So the defense contractors, possibly oil companies, bankers, saying, no, we're not going to have Trump. Maybe we have this kid, maybe we have Gary Johnson, and probably we can live with Hillary Clinton, but it ain't going to be Trump. They end the letter this way. We are convinced that in the Oval Office, he, meaning Donald Trump, would be the most reckless president in American history. A lot of the Republican heavyweights, not all of them, but a lot of them have decided under no circumstances will they allow Donald Trump to become the next president of the United States.